great to see a lot of the people that I've worked with in the past, and in fact even some former clients, right? We've got some NASA folks here as well. So I'm not as smart as everyone who's been up here yet, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some different things, about designing for space, designing for different subjects, a little bit differently than some of the speakers have talked about a bit before, right? I don't have the sort of nerd quotient that a lot of these people have. In fact, I wanted to wear my Google Glass out on stage, and it's just shook her head, right? So I wasn't able to do that. But anyways, like Marie says, I work at GE. It's a very interesting place to work right now. In fact, what's really exciting about GE is that we're building a team. We're building a team of UX designers and developers and a whole bunch of people to work on some really, really challenging projects. In fact, when you think of GE, typically think of light bulbs, microwaves, right? We don't get to work on that stuff, although that's pretty cool. Walk around here where the speakers aren't feedback. But what we do get to work on is what this idea of this industrial internet, right? Which is basically the internet of things, which you're all very familiar with, but it's the internet of really big things, right? So these are gas turbines, these are nuclear power plants, these are all sorts of like jet engines, really, really big, gnarly projects that have a really interesting challenge, some really interesting challenges in terms of interfacing with those machines. So my team gets to do that, right? We get to figure out how to talk to these machines and how to really make that happen. At the same time, my team also gets to do, so we sort of lead UX and watch UX and foster that growth all around the world. At the same time, we get to do things with the brand. And what's really interesting is we have a UX team within a major company like this who's actually leading brand. And what that gives us is the opportunity is to change the way that the brand is viewed within a large company like this. Typically, it's a very marketing-centered effort. We're trying to transform it to become much more experiential. So I'll talk a little bit about that as I get going. So I tend to think that designing for space is a lot like this. I'm just going to put that out there. I think if you're a designer and you're facing the challenges of what many massive, complex projects that's put in front of you, if you can solve for this type of thing, you can probably solve for this. And the reason why I said that is because when you look at designing these massive, complex projects that have a life cycle of a lot of different iterations, a lot of different users, a lot of different really interesting interactions, it really kind of boils down to two things that I think are very, very important. Those two things that come across all the time are context and constraint. Now, a lot of people look at these two words, and if you're a designer, you sort of start to freak out, right? Because these two words can be actually very challenging for designers to work with. On one hand, context means a whole bunch of things, right? You talk about location, you talk about time of use, you talk about different users, different use cases, different types. All this stuff starts swirling in your head. And if you're a mobile designer, you live this, right? This is something that you're involved with all the time. Constraints are also what designers tend to think of as enemies, right? Because constraints lock us in, right? They won't let us be creative. They won't let us think outside the box. They won't let us explore new ways of solving problems. I've actually come to fall in love with constraints. I love the idea of constraints because it provides focus. And focus is really, really important for designers, especially when you're dealing with situations like this. And almost even more so when you're dealing with situations like this, right? But let's just focus on this for now. Maybe this. No, we'll go back to this. Anyway, so I think that constraints and context are really, really sort of recurring themes that come across almost every design project. And I want to talk to you a little bit about a project that I got a chance to work on with Victoria's Secret. So what was interesting about Victoria's Secret, so when I was at Razorfish, I left Adaptive Path, went to Razorfish, and I had a slew of designers all across the West Coast, and we were working on some really amazing projects. And this is the part where no one really pays attention to me, right? I'll keep talking. Anyway, so I think, so one of the really challenging projects we had was actually working with Victoria's Secret. It's a well-known brand, a really, really popular brand, and people who love this brand are really, really invested in it. And people go out of their way to associate themselves with this brand when they buy those types of products all the time. Well, they came to the Razorfish team and they said, hey, we really need to develop an iOS app. We really want to get this app game, right? There has to be an app for that, right? So one of the challenges that the design team came up with was, okay, so we have iOS devices, we have an iPhone, we have an iPad, what do? Do we just make it same app and sort of release it. And then quickly they started to understand the use case, the context of use of people who were associating themselves with the brand and the people that would actually use this application. And what they realized is that if you're in a store, if you're in the Victoria's Secret store, chances are you don't have an iPad with you. You do have an iPhone, right? You do have a smartphone, right? And there's a way that you can actually use that. Can we change that smartphone into a tool that allows people to engage with the brand in a very contextually appropriate manner? So the app that was developed was something that you could actually take and you could scan the barcode and you could see what items were in stock, what colors were available. If the item was in stock at this store, there was a local store nearby that had that product. Or you could actually add to cart, buy it right then and have it shipped home, right? So the app that was designed for the iPhone was very contextually aware of who you are. It sort of gets your intent if you're shopping in the store. And it provided you tools that enabled you to be very successful at those goals when you're in that particular context. And the constraints in this case were the fact that the device that we wanted people to use had to fit in their pocket, otherwise they weren't going to carry it to their store, right? So we knew that we were constrained by device and technology. Sharp contrast, though, is with the iPad. When you're at home with the iPad, right, chances are you're on the couch, you have a lot longer time to engage with the type of experience that you're working with. And in that case, that gave us an opportunity to have a different type of relationship with the brand. People could watch videos, they could engage with the models a little bit more, they could understand the product a little bit better. In fact, maybe they could even build a wish list and then go buy those products later. So again, be very contextually aware of that type of experience. Now, I think the same holds true when you talk about space, right? When I was at Adaptive Path, one of my very last projects, one of my most favorite projects was actually working with NASA about bringing iPads into space, right? So the project that we saw a little bit earlier is very similar to some of the things that we were exploring. And we were looking at ways to, again, pay attention to context and constraints. And constraints in space, if you think constraints in space on Earth is a problem, constraints in space is a really big deal. Things like no gravity and things like cosmic radiation, right? Those are challenges that designers really don't have to deal with when they're down here on Earth, right? I don't think about my website as being sort of affected by cosmic radiation. But in space, totally a problem you have to deal with. But what's interesting about the context side of things in space is that I think, and it's funny, there's actually some interesting similarities between models and astronauts, right? On one hand, they're very busy people. They have a lot of things going on. They have to pay attention to a lot of things, have their schedules busy. At the same time, they're also very lonely people, right? So I think there's really interesting ways to design for those challenges, right? So one of the ideas that we came up with for astronauts was, you saw that image before of that sort of junk. There's all that stuff around on station, right? What we heard from astronauts, and I actually got to talk to someone at Capcom, right? So my 13-year-old self was jumping for joy. Just much like my 13-year-old self was jumping for joy when I got to work with Victoria's Secret. So sort of compare that to. But anyways, when I got to talk to somebody at Capcom, that was an actual astronaut, right? You could hear the challenges that they faced. And one of the things that they said was, hey, we're so cramped for space on station, we don't know where to put things half the time. And one of the things, this story really stuck out with me, is they would take a panel off the wall and they'd put a wrench in there and put the panel back, because that was a place to put it, right? But then they'd forget where they put that wrench. And that's a problem, right? That's a challenge that you have to really design around. So one of the things that we came up with is, what if we tagged everything of relevance on the station? And I don't know if this is very achievable, but it was an idea that we could tag things, and then we could use the iPad almost as a viewport. You could sort of scan around station. You could say, oh, there's my wrench, there's my spare toilet paper, there's my Victoria's Secret catalog. You could basically sort of map out what was hidden behind some of these walls based on the application. Another thing that I really, really liked, and I sort of was very touching, was this idea of addressing sort of that relationship between people on station or in the space shuttle and the people that they left at home. And that designing for that challenge was really, really moving. And we sort of thought that was a real case. We never quite read it if that was something that we needed to move forward with. But if you think about it, what if you could essentially use an iPad to create a viewport through walls, right? You could have a whole bunch of things triangulating cameras and all that stuff to make it feel real. But you could effectively point it at a wall that had no window, and suddenly you have a window. And what if you then added more data and information to make that experience even richer? What if you said, look, your son is waking up at 6 a.m. and he's about to come online, and you held that, and you were able to watch sort of the Earth rotate, or you actually rotate on the Earth, right? And there was that connection, right? That was a really interesting challenge an idea to design for. So I think, again, I don't think I have much more time. I think I've already gone over time. But I just wanted to say that I think that the two things that really recur to me after being a designer for 20 years is this idea of context, designing for context, paying attention to context, whether that's e-commerce and sort of, in the mall type stores, or whether it's up in space. Context is a really, really big deal that you have to pay attention to as a designer. And then again, learning to embrace constraints as your friend. As a designer, it's not a challenge, it's actually a toolkit that you can use, much like your Pantone swatches or your tablet or whatever. Constraints are actually your friend as a designer. So embracing that tends to really make your designs a lot richer and a lot more accurate. So I think that's a very valuable thing. So again, thank you very much for your time. I just want to put one thing out there. You probably get, we are hiring. We're actually building a really amazing talent team. We're building an agency within GE that's going to manage design for GE globally and brand for GE globally. And if you're an interaction designer or a visual designer, I would love to have you on my team. So you're welcome to talk to me afterwards, or if you just want to email this email address, and I would love to talk to you a little bit more. So again, thank you very much for your time and patience.